So hello and welcome to this second and final talk for this academic year, at the very least, of the mini-series of seminars on Archipelagic Indias, a series which is organized within the framework of the Marie Sklodowska-Curie project IATIO, India and the Indian Ocean in the Decolonial Period, coordinated by Professor Ananya Jahanara Kabir, and of which I am the research fellow. My name is Luca Raimondi. So I would like to start by thanking those that have made it possible for the seminar to exist. Ananya, who co-organized the seminar series with me, our speakers, present and past, and the King's India Institute for their collaboration and hospitality, particularly in the persons of Professor Louis Tillin, the Institute Director, and Vignesh Rajamani for all the work behind the scenes without which this seminar today wouldn't be screening. The mini-series Archipelagic Indias was started by Ananya and I last year, in the last academic year, with 4 seminars, 2 on the Andaman Islands and 2 on the Lakshadweep. And for this season, we wanted to open up thematically to include the tidal geographies of the Sundarbans. Last month, we had with us Shweta Chatterjee of Pittsburgh University, who spoke about the print cultures of the Sundarbans, focusing specifically on a periodical from the early 2000s. And if you missed that seminar, and if you're also interested in catching up with the seminars that we ran last year, you can find all of the recording on the YouTube page of King's College London Global Affairs YouTube channel, where you will also find the recordings for all of the other seminars and events run by the King's India Institute. So today we have with us Dr. Calynn Dowler. Calynn is an assistant professor of religious studies at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Her research and teaching expertise lie at the intersection of religious studies and environmental anthropology. And her current book project explores ethical and religious relationships with water in the Sundarbans Delta of West Bengal under conditions of socio-ecological transformation associated with migration, agrarian development, and climate change. Calynn's talk today is titled "The Pool of Water, Power, Place, and Religion in the Sundarbans." As usual for our seminar series, the talk will be followed by a short response from Professor Ananya Kabir, and then we will open up to questions. If you do have questions, you will be able to drop them in the Q&A chat box, and we will collect them and try to address as many as possible at the end of the presentation. I think we are ready to start. So on to you, Calynn.
Thank you. And let me also begin just by thanking you, Luca, and also thanking Professor Kabir and Vignesh for all of their assistance in bringing this together and for the invitation to speak with you today. I will be discussing some of my ongoing work relating to water and religion in the Sundarbans. And I will explain momentarily how I arrived at this title, The Pool of Water, and what I mean when I talk about water pooling, not P-O-O-L, but P-U-L-L. But first I'll begin with a brief outline of my talk, and I will also set myself a timer so that I do not get carried away. Okay, so share the screen. Okay. I'm going to begin by just giving an overview of the research setting where I conducted work. I'm going to talk a little bit about encounters across religious difference in this region and the links with ecology. And I'm going to engage with some critical perspectives on the paradigm of syncretism, I'm then going to forward archipelagic thinking, which is new for me, and I have been encountering through this opportunity as an alternative to some of these syncretistic paradigms. I'll talk a little bit about mixing in the Sundarbans, mixing across religious difference, and also mixing between people and elements of the ecology and divine and immaterial beings. And then I'll move into the discussion of the pool of water and water, place, and power. So, to give a brief introduction, the Sundarbans is the littoral archipelago that spans the India-Bangladesh border. I've been working on a riverine island in the delta on the West Bengal side of the border since 2016. And for the project that I'll be discussing today, I spent approximately 30 months in India. I conducted research in a multi-ethnic and multi-religious island in the Sundarbans. Most of my work to date focuses on relationships with water. And of course, this is a place that is shaped by many different flows of water. The Meghna, Brahmaputra, and Ganges rivers flow into the Bay of Bengal, and they engage in constant processes of land creation and destruction along the way. Twice a day, the saltwater tides of the bay then stretch more than 200 miles inland, and there they mingle with the rivers to sustain the world's largest mangrove forest, which you can see in this aerial picture is in the dark green. Now, the area where my research is based is slightly to the north of that dark green area on one of the inhabited islands, these tan spaces, which have been settled primarily by fishing and farming communities. I'll give a very brief overview of the island where I work. Settlement in this space began during the British colonial period. It's been inhabited for approximately 150 years. At that time, landlords who were based outside of the Sundarbans recruited laborers to clear the mangrove forests and to start cultivation. And so various migrant and refugee groups have transformed this space from mangrove swamps into habitable agrarian terrain. These groups come from various parts of what is now India and Bangladesh. So there are Adivasi groups originally from the Choto-Nagpur Plateau, what's today Jharkhand mostly. There are settlers from what is now Orissa, Mednipur, parts of 24 Parganas, and there are also many migrants and refugees from East Bengal, former East Pakistan, what is now Bangladesh. So the village where I worked, which had little over 3,000 people, is really religiously diverse. 85% of my interlocutors identified as Hindu. Most of these belong to scheduled castes, Pondra, Nomoshudra, etc., for those who are familiar with the social geography of this region. This figure, though, it also includes some members of scheduled tribes who identify as Hindu today. In addition to this, 10% of my interlocutors were these are approximate figures, were Muslim, and 5% were Christian. And so the island where I work had some very early Christian settlements. Today, this relatively small percentage of the Christian population is itself internally very diverse, with Catholics, Baptists, Church of North India, and Seventh-day Adventists. And so where I was based for fieldwork, within a 10-minute walking radius, all of these different groups were living there, and there were mosques and churches and temples, etc. So this is a very diverse religious setting. Over the 20th century, this island was cleared and embanked, and this is a picture from an 1857 map. So this shows the island prior to that process. It was uninhabited mangrove forest. It was also not a contiguous landmass at that point because it had not been embanked yet. And so there is a process that the historian Debjani Bhattacharya refers to as the drying and draining of the delta under British colonial rule. And though her work really focuses on the city of Calcutta, these processes were happening in the lower delta as well. And of course, this drying and draining was not undertaken for no reason. It was a process of property creation. It was to create land that could then be farmed and taxed. Here you can see one of the earthen ring embankments that surrounds the islands today, without which they would be submerged at high tide. Many of these embankments still date from the colonial period, although they more recently, especially following several damaging cyclones, have started to be replaced by concrete and brick reinforced embankments. So rivers are one form of water that my work engages, but of course there are others as well. This is a monsoonal climate. Here's a picture of an inundated paddy field. And the monsoon rains are really critical for life and especially for agriculture in the Delta. These rains make, rice farming possible, they replenish aquifers, etc., and are absolutely critical. There are problems relating to excess when it comes to the monsoon at times. Too much rain can be an issue. On the other hand, in the dry season, scarcity can become an issue. So my interest in water isn't only relating to this very wet place, but also to moments of scarcity and the challenges that can present for people. This is a place that gets very dry. You can see here, this was taken in May, and there are these big, deep cracks in the earth during this hottest time of year. And at times, groundwater aquifers, it's becoming a growing issue that public tube wells often will fail and not bring up groundwater during this time of year. And then people are scrambling for drinking water, etc. So all of these different waters that I've mentioned give some indication of the fact that water appears in a multiplicity of forms in this setting and that it carries many different meanings. This has led me to think about the question of what water is and what water becomes in different relational contexts. I approach this question primarily through an engagement with theory from religious studies and environmental anthropology. My work has really been shaped by recent perspectives that challenge dualisms of nature and culture and incorporate other than human elements and beings and forces into accounts of human social and cultural life. So I have been looking at how meanings of water emerge within webs of different relationships. These relationships include people, land, mud, aquatic plants, and animals. And I've really been thinking with some recent ethnographies like Laura Ogden's Swamp Life or Katerina Scaramelli's How to Make a Wetland, just to name a few. And these approaches look at aqueous spaces as multi-species assemblages. But there is a religious studies piece to my work, and I'm not only trying to think about relationships with ecology, but also other kinds of beings, specifically deities and spirits, which are also understood to inhabit the waterscape. Some of the region's rivers, for example, are considered the embodiment of divinity. So this is a Ganga Puja for the Hindu goddess Ganga. Not all people in the Sundarbans consider the rivers to be sacred, but for many fishing communities, their patron deity is Ganga Devi, and they venerate her in the way that you can see here. This is an annual Ganga Puja that's held. And so they will make offerings, for example, of sweets, flowers, and fruits. And it's understood that the goddess's power, or Shakti, also regenerates the community that gathers to worship her. So in a broad sense, my work is trying to think through the fact that you can't understand people's relationships with place or water in the Sundarbans without recognizing these divine and immaterial beings that animate the ecologies with meaning and obligation. Okay, so that's a very broad overview, but now I'll move into thinking a little bit more about religious encounter and ecology. The example of Ganga Devi falls within a recognizably Hindu frame, but this is not always the case when we are discussing immaterial agencies and divine beings in the Sundarbans. There are several that are venerated across otherwise salient religious divides, such as Bon Bibi pictured here. Bon Bibi is a forest superpower and considered the symbolic mother of all who inhabit the Sundarbans. Her name approximately translates to mean Lady of the Forest. Here she's pictured seated on a tiger, as you can see, with her brother Shah Jangoli. and she's venerated by forest workers of different religious backgrounds for protection from tiger attacks. Scholars like Anu Jaleh and Sufia Uddin have argued that Bon Bibi is venerated by Hindus as a goddess in a similar way to other goddesses, and by Muslims, on the other hand, as a Sufi Pirani or a female peer who possesses special powers from Allah. So a lot of the work on religion and ecology in the Sundarbans has focused, a lot of the work to date has focused on Bon Bibi. And sometimes, not the scholars that I just mentioned, but sometimes Bon Bibi veneration has been described by others or described more popularly as a kind of syncretic folk religion, as a mixture of, for example, Islam and Hinduism. And some of the implications of this can be a little bit pejorative, implying that it's a kind of mixed up scramble that's not quite right. And scholars of religion in Bengal have really critiqued the syncretism paradigm. They have argued that it is problematic because it pays very little attention to what these beliefs or practices mean in the lives of adherents. And it also tends to approach religions as essentialized, dehistoricized, and monolithic entities. So it reifies traditions as bounded, discrete, and timeless. This idea of syncretism also implies that some traditions are inauthentic or contaminated while others might be pure. So, you know, the issue with describing some religious traditions as syncretic is, of course, that all religious traditions draw upon diverse ideas and practices to some degree. So if we can't really make that analytic distinction. So in developing these critiques and building on them, scholars like Sufia Uddin have argued that we really should pay more attention to emic meanings, to practices, and to the realities of the social and ecological context. What all of these critiques share is an insistence that scholars need to pay attention to history, to process, to agency, and to power. So that's really, with these critiques in mind, this is where I am thinking about some alternatives and trying to think about archipelagic perspectives as a possible alternative. How can we understand spaces of dynamic religious encounter like the Sundarbans? Can we think beyond this paradigm of syncretism? In the remainder of my talk today, I will suggest that yes, we can, and that in fact, the Delta's fluid topography, or should I say archipelago's fluid topography, can help us understand these relationships in new ways. I was really grateful for this opportunity, the opportunity to give this talk today, because it's offered me a chance to engage with archipelagic thinking, which I had not done before. So this is a field of study that I was admittedly somewhat unfamiliar with prior to this occasion, and I'm still learning a lot about. But I think that archipelagic studies and related discussions of cultural encounter are really helpful for me and for some of the material that I'm working through right now. So I'm going to try to put my work into dialogue with these perspectives. And of course, Clisson is such an important figure in the field. So when I started reading up on some archipelagic thinking, I started with his Poetics of Relation. This is a philosophy grounded in the Antilles archipelago, and he develops a kind of rhizomatic thought in which each and every identity, or to quote him, in which each and every identity is extended through a relationship with the other. I've found this really stimulating as I think about the poetics and the politics of relation at my research site. So for the remainder of this talk, I will try to integrate some of what I have been learning from archipelagic studies with my work on relationships with various others. This includes religious others, but I'm also trying to think about the other in an expansive and capacious way, including non-human others like aquatic animals and water itself, as well as these divine and immaterial agencies that I mentioned. So I'll add that I think water is an ideal substance for thinking about the poetics and politics of relation because it simultaneously connects and divides. And of course, I'm not the first person to note this. There's a very rich body of literature about water and its relational qualities. Veronica Strang, a well-known scholar of water, has argued that water is really an ideal medium for considering material and ideational flows between scales. And those scales could be as micro as the human body, or as vast as the atmosphere, because you can find water in all of these sites and locations, and there's much flow between them. So, returning to water and relationality in the Sundarbans, I've also really benefited from some of Professor Kabir's recent work, which brings archipelagic thinking into conversations about cultural mixing and creolization, or extends these conversations. In a recently published article in the Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry, she discusses creolization in terms of, quote, innovations, improvisations, collaborations, and compromises arising from unexpected encounters between people transplanted to unfamiliar spaces, whether contingently, voluntarily, or against their volition in the course of capitalist modernity, end quote. This reflection on creolization resonated with me and with what I've been writing about the Sundarbans, because I think the Delta is one such space where people not only encountered other people from various ethnic and religious backgrounds, but also a very unfamiliar and challenging ecology. So part of my work has been to collect oral histories of migration and settlement on this island. And in those oral histories, a sense of the island as what James Scott has called a shatter zone, or a zone of refuge, to borrow his term, emerges. So I think we can look at the Sundarbans as a shatter zone of empire and also of nation states. So first the British Empire, and later the porous borderland of independent India and Bangladesh. So living in this challenging space has entailed a lot of innovations, improvisations, collaborations, and compromises. And that's what I'm going to turn to now in a discussion of mixing. Okay, just checking the time. So, mixing. Reflecting these histories of migration and the mixed social geography of the islands, people in the village where I completed my research often use the phrase "Amra milemishe thaki," meaning we all live mixed together. And at first, I thought of this mostly as a metaphor, the same as when people likened their village to Khichuri, which I've pictured here. Khichuri, for those of you who are not familiar, is a kind of hodgepodge dish or stew made of rice, lentils, and vegetables. But as time went on, I realized that when people talked about mixing, they weren't just describing the island's diverse social geography. Rather, mixing entailed a number of active practices. Sometimes these practices extended across social boundaries, especially those of religion. And I actually noticed that when people use this phrase milemishe, they were often describing how Hindus, Muslims, and Christians lived together in the space of the village. And they had other metaphors for this too, but I'll just leave it at this for now. At its most fundamental, this mixing was a social activity. So one way to mix with someone would just be to speak with them or to spend time together, to stop and chat about your day when you're passing by someone's house, to exchange pleasantries, to ask questions, and just generally involving yourself in the life of another person. But I've also included this picture here and this example because there were other ways of mixing, such as sharing food, that became important at particular times. So as I found out over time, people of different religious communities would often assist each other by providing a small amount of money, a small donation or contribution to fund each other's holidays and religious celebrations. So the religious community that hosted the celebration, whether it was Durga Puja or Christmas, or on one occasion, the inauguration of a new mosque in the village, so the sponsoring religious group would make a big pot of khichdi to share. And in other cases, there were differences in terms of what people would eat. Pork, would they, if they were Muslim, they wouldn't eat pork, of course, and issues with beef, etc. But khichdi was vegetarian. And so it solved these issues and it presented a way to gather together and to share food. So this is another example of mixing. Apart from these social elements of relationality, mixing often entailed economic exchanges, and these economic exchanges could be informal or formalized, often informal. And they really embedded people in complicated webs of debt and reciprocity with each other. Importantly, though, whether this mixing was social or economic, these relationships also involved a very important affective dimension. Sometimes these affects were negative, so there could be anger or resentment. But in many cases, social and economic interdependence also generated sentiments of love and affection. So people often spoke of these sentiments using the idiom of the pool, P-U-L-L, the affective pool or tan that developed. So I learned that the idea of a pool, or maybe in English we might say a tug, the closest equivalent that I can think of is maybe a tug at your heartstrings. But this pool was an important idiom of relationality. One of my acquaintances exclaimed that the pool of the heart, the monartan, held people together as strongly as the force of gravity. And I've put this picture of a magnet here because he said it's like the pull of a magnet. And he explained that I had been pulled into everyday life in the village by the force of my affection for people there. And that someday, inevitably, I would also be pulled home by my ties to my family and friends in the US. And he wrapped it all up by saying it's all just relationships, isn't it? So these relationships are what I have been trying to think more about. And over time, I found that they extended to the land and waterscape itself. So you could also mix with land and water, and these mixings also shaped even the qualities of your body or your personality. So people in the Sundarbans often say that their health or personality is influenced by the salty water they drink, the salt in the air that they breathe, and the mud with which they come into frequent contact during their work. So sometimes they say that these qualities of the landscape can make them irritable or cantankerous. This is something that Anujale has also noted in her work. But on the other hand, the land and waterscape was seen as making people healthy and hardy. And they would frequently comment on this and sometimes contrast it to outsiders like me, who were seen as soft sometimes or more norum. So this is a deeply embodied relationship to place that is generated through material practices of mixing, often through work like fishing and farming, mixing with the ecology. So as you can guess at this point, these were not only material ways of mixing, they also involved affective relationships. And I found that there were other relationships with place that mattered in significant ways for people. These relationships were slightly more ambiguous than those with other people or with the materiality of the ecology alone. But the affective idiom of the pool sometimes came into sometimes emerged in these cases as well. For example, people would frequently speak of Joletan, or the pool of water. That's how I've translated it in any case. And they explained that the pool of water refers to a powerful, inexorable attraction for water that can sometimes develop in people. It's most common and most dangerous among small children. It draws them repeatedly and inexplicably to the edges of ponds and creeks, and these are very ubiquitous in this space. And at its most extreme, the power of water can even lure people into the water unintentionally. So in other cases, my interlocutors, especially women, described their experiences of a sense of someone tugging on their foot or leg while they're bathing. And these uncanny experiences were in these cases, almost always attributed to immaterial agencies that were submerged below the water. A local gunin or healer explained to me that water has a kind of power, a komota, and that malevolent spirits often dwell in water bodies. Sometimes they try to entice humans to enter their watery worlds. I had been speaking with this particular healer because he was well known for his protective amulets, like steel bangles that were imbued with mantras and thought to diminish or cut the pool of water and to keep people on safe and firm ground. These methods, along with keeping a very careful eye, especially on small children, were effective, were seen as largely effective. But at the same time, there were some water bodies that were seen as more powerful and were referred to as jagroto, or awakened. Their power was more difficult to engage. And so I have a picture right here of one such water body. And it was said to be inhabited by powerful water beings who engaged in the life of the village in various ways, especially in the past. And in the course of my research, I suppose I also became caught up in the mesmerizing power of water in some sense, because I really became immersed in these stories about this water body and others like it. And I've been trying to better understand people's relationships, not only with the water itself, but with the fish and the aquatic animals, and also with the water beings that are said to inhabit these watery spaces. So this water body, which is referred to as a kal, a channel or a creek, it used to be connected to the river, but when the island was embanked, it was eventually sealed off, and it has since become a freshwater reservoir. And the area around this creek was all previously government-owned fallow land where no one had property rights. And for this reason, it was settled by some marginal groups of Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. What really interested me about this space was the fact that these different groups told extremely similar stories about their engagements with the water beings that were held to inhabit this space. I don't want to imply that everyone had exactly the same relationship with this water body, or that everyone was, convinced about these stories relating to water beings. Some people, especially those with more education, dismissed these stories as a form of superstition or nonsense. But even they knew the stories and sometimes enjoyed chatting about them with me, even if they ultimately dismissed them. On the other hand, there were people who were invested in the veracity of these stories, and regardless of where someone stood on this spectrum, people seemed to share a sense that this was a part of the village's heritage and past, dating from the earliest years of settlement on the island. And the second thing that became clear to me early on was the fact that these beings don't really fit very easily within a single cosmological or religious frame. They were sometimes referred to as ghosts, sometimes as deities or devota, sometimes as opodevota, implying a malevolence. Sometimes, some of my Muslim interlocutors hazarded a guess that they could be jinn. I even heard them referred to as the devil or as shaitan. So they were ontologically quite slippery. Very frequently, though, they were referred to as joko, and described also very frequently as feminine. So I have been able to connect some of these stories with pan-Indian discussions of yaksha and yakshis, which are understood as semi-divine guardian spirits that inhabit forests, lakes, rivers, and certain types of trees. And in his authoritative accounts of yaksha and yakshi in Indian iconography, the art historian Anand Kumaraswamy notes that they were treated with both fear and respect as entities that were, quote, wonderful, mysterious, supernatural, unknown, and endowed with many magical powers. Despite their slippery ontological status, the stories that I heard in the Sundarbans were strikingly consistent. Golden boats maneuvering up and down the creek in the middle of the night, a woman in a red bordered sari scattering coins across the water, an underwater temple, and homes that were filled with sumptuous spreads of food. Stories about the creek were also replete with memories of the brilliance and the clarity of the water, as if gold lay just below the surface. So these memories were often linked to discussions of the water beings' vast troves of wealth. However, these beings were seen sometimes as quite malevolent. They are said to have communicated in earlier years with settlers via dreams, and to have demanded people in exchange for the gold that they hoarded in the depths of the water. So they might make this sort of offer to someone in a dream, and if they didn't comply, they might take what they wanted anyhow. And they're said to have taken, for example, some water buffaloes from a prominent landholding family. And there are other related stories. So they're quite terrifying in some ways. And on the other hand, they're very ambivalent because they're seen as benevolent givers of fish. And they're also said to sometimes assume the form of fish and other aquatic animals. So these stories really emphasize the fact that this creek used to be populated by crocodiles and indigenous species of fish. And these water beings are said to frequently assume the form of such aquatic animals. Many people referenced earlier sightings that they'd heard about of crocodiles and fish adorned with red vermilion powder on their foreheads or with golden nose rings. And there's a particularly common story about one of the earliest settlers on the island, a Christian man who received a dream from one of these water beings, and the water being assumed the form of a crocodile and he shot the crocodile. But later on, his son drowned, and this occurrence was attributed to the agency of the water beings. And it was also linked to the fact that he had shot the crocodile. So what I have been thinking about are these stories in which humans are sometimes punished for their actions against non-human animals, or their activities are thwarted by the powers of the creek. And I think it reflects, on the one hand, a respect and a fear, people frequently use the word fear, poi, a respect for the powers of the non-human world and a relatively circumscribed concept of human agency. So fishing in the creek has traditionally been governed by a set of ritual obligations, offerings of sweets, incense, sometimes candles, as you'll see here, can be made on a banana leaf during a simple ceremony at the water's edge prior to casting the nets. This is done for protection and to yield large catches. And it's said if these offerings are not made, then the water beings may tangle up fishermen's nets. But if they're done properly, they'll give fish generously. So these sorts of rituals are ongoing, and I observed a few while I was conducting research. They bear a resemblance to what's sometimes referred to as Makal Thakur Puja, veneration of an aniconic deity known as Makal Thakur, a fish deity, and these pujas are similarly performed for a good catch. But to my knowledge, I've never heard Makal Thakur invoked in a way with the same kind of malevolence that some of these water beings are discussed in those terms. So this is an example of an offering made by a Christian group. You can see that there's a small mud cross here alongside these 3 balls of clay, which is a traditional way of performing this ritual. And, in summary, these beings are seen as dangerous, so you want to stay on good terms with them. But something that I'm also trying to understand is how these relationships are changing at present. What happens when archipelagos of memory and meaning transform in the present moment? Even in spite of some of the rituals that I just mentioned, most people in the village are now discussing water beings as located in the past tense. They will say that potent spirits once dwelled in the creek, but people are unsure if they remain today. Some people posit that they may have escaped into the river or gone deep into hiding in groundwater aquifers, but almost everyone agreed that they were now vanished or extinct. So the question is why? And thinking back to the discussion of mixing that I was talking about, I think it has to do with a process of unmixing in this space that's unfolding. This creek has recently become private property. Parts of it are used as a commercial fishery. The water is bought and sold for irrigation purposes. And these changes are part and parcel of much broader shifts toward an economization and a privatization of water in the Delta. But they're not just symbolic transformations. In other words, if we think of property as a symbolic regime or a regime of ideological representation, I think that would limit our understanding, because these are processes of enclosure that in many cases sever people's material embodied ties with water. Many people simply don't fish there anymore. And the ecology of the creek itself has also transformed. So there's no more of these large indigenous species of fish. They're farming fish primarily. There's no more crocodiles. And these are such an important part of these stories relating to water beings. So I also don't think we can discount the role of new currents of religious thought that present religious life in much more bounded and exclusive terms and leave a little bit less space for ambiguous figures like water beings. And apart from this, when people are talking about these changes, they will often say that these water beings have left because humans are torturing them. So this is a kind of moral discourse about these changes. And some of this torture is associated with water pollution. So people will wash their dishes and utensils and such in the creek. And as you can see, there are bits of trash and styrofoam, as you can see in this photo. And people will say that these are very unpleasant conditions, and a deity or a devota would not want to stay in such a polluted place. And so they have had to leave. So these are stories about socio-ecological change, and they are really moral and political commentaries on those changes as well. To wrap up then, I think I have a few more minutes remaining. Archipelagic thinking, insofar as it is fundamentally relational, I think it allows us to think about encounters between humans, aqueous ecologies, and divine and immaterial beings. It's helped me look at some themes in my research, namely place, water, and power in a new way. This is a framework that differs from the syncretism paradigm insofar as it focuses on histories of displacement, settlement, and placemaking, dynamic encounters between humans and other than human elements and beings, and situated practices like storytelling, fishing, rituals, and changes in material and spiritual power over time. However, I don't think that archipelagic thinking necessarily explains all of the ambiguous elements of water beings that I discussed today. And I don't mean that as a critique. I think actually one of the ideas that I have found most powerful and helpful is within Glissant's relational poetics, for example, is when he's talking about opacity. So he's famously argued for the right to opacity and has argued against reduction and assimilation of difference that can occur within scholarship as well as in activist circles. And this is something that I'm still thinking with, but I've been really struck by a metaphor from Poetics of Relation of knowledge seeking as a kind of grasping toward transparency and explication. And he describes this grasping as, quote, a gesture of enclosure, if not appropriation. And I was just so struck by that because I have been thinking for a little bit now about water as something that I can't quite grasp, something that is always slipping through my fingers, maybe literally, but also in my writing. And like the water of the creek, the stories and the practices that I've outlined today are not completely transparent. They're a little bit murky. But in academia, we're pushed to clarify, to explain, and to resolve these sorts of tensions and to render all of the confusing elements of life more fully transparent. That, to me, that's not really how my interlocutors seem to approach these questions. And I'm not totally sure that it's how I want to approach them either. Because I really found that while my Hindu, Muslim, and Christian interlocutors shared an orientation toward this water body as an abode of powerful water beings, they didn't have a single explanatory framework. And I particularly remember one man who kind of laughed at me and he just said, "We also don't know what the thing is." So my conversations about water beings weren't marked by the kind of certainty that often emerges in academic accounts or even accounts in anthropology, for example, recent accounts of ontological politics. There was not a sense of ontological closure that characterized these conversations, at least in my view. So I think in some ways, my research seems to underscore an opacity of water and of water beings, an opacity that I think has been generative in terms of a relationship to place which is capacious enough to be shared across these otherwise salient distinctions. So my tentative suggestion is that the Sundarbans waterscape has emerged over time as a shared reservoir of meaning and orientation for these diverse groups. And it has happened partially through common engagements with watery places that resonate with a form of spiritual power that's really difficult to fully grasp or categorize, but is nonetheless seen as real and important. this spiritual power has generated shared forms of place-based belonging that exceed these bounded articulations of difference. And so that is my tentative suggestion at this point, and I have really valued this opportunity to think with some work in archipelagic studies. I found it very stimulating, and I look forward to your thoughts and comments. Thank you. I will stop sharing now.
Thanks so much. Luca, are you there? Yes.
Sorry, I am here. Yes. Thank you so much, Calynn. It was really fascinating. I was finishing writing my notes, and I think we can start with Ananya's response. But before we do so, can I just ask, because it's a very simple question, doesn't need too much articulation in your answer. Maybe you mentioned it. What is the name of the island that you were working on? Maybe I just missed it, but
oh, I think I didn't mention it. Yeah, I worked in Bashanti. It's called Bashanti. Yeah. So
okay.
Yeah. But I just don't name the village just for kind of according to anthropological practice. Yeah.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So should I try to offer some comments? Luca, is it over to me now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, it was really stimulating. Thank you so much, Calynn, for giving us these thoughts, which are exciting because they're on the one hand based on this intimate knowledge and lived experience and your ethnography of this place, and on the other you're pushing out into new realms of theorizing and thinking about what you already know. So we were treated to, I think, a really interesting mix of things that you know very well and new steps that you're taking. So that's what we want these seminars to be. So thank you for absolutely seeing that this is a safe space to do such things with and in. So I have just a few suggestions, observations, again, to help you along this new path. And it's a path that we're all kind of newly embarked on. I mean, the essay of mine that you so generously referred to was really trying to make sense of, as I said, all these new things that we are now interested in. But precisely for that reason, I myself felt I wanted to take stock of it all. How do these different interests of mine, obviously they're linked somewhere in my brain, but can I have a sensible, account of how they might link up for other people? And I'm so happy that, again, it seemed to make some sense to you. So I think one of the main takeaways, I think, from your talk for all of us, absolutely, is this return to this hoary term, syncretism, which we kind of all inherited and in different ways. And clearly, it's time to give it a refresh and, try to historicize it. Why did it keep appearing at a certain time? Why are certain cultural practices in South Asia, why is this term favored, for them? And you really, I think, answered that urgent need, because we all know that this term has been instrumentalized in very many ways. For example, Kashmir, is a place of syncretism, and what does that do to the political discourse around Kashmir? So it's a Nehruvian concept. It has its moments. It had its, sort of uses, and it's really time to update it and historicize it, and maybe even say it's absolutely not adequate. And Tony Stewart, of course, has been a critic of this term, and you cited some of his work where, working in a similar region to yours, he's mounted this critique, and you're taking it further. I myself have been grappling with the utility of this term. I mean, politically, we know it's complicated, but almost like, what can you say? Epistemologically or theoretically, does it still have some traction? And I felt that, I feel that it's kind of, it's because, for example, writers from Cuba, Benitez Rojo, people, they use this idea of supersyncretism as well. So clearly it's not something that only, those of us working on the Indian subcontinent in South Asia very, closely kind of tend, maybe we don't realize that in other places and times it's also invoked. And maybe, therefore, if people find it a go-to concept, well, what can we say about it before saying it's really not a concept we want to engage with at all? So for me, I've kind of come to this intermediary thought process around syncretism, that perhaps syncretism is a good word to try and explain what happens when people recognize similarities in practices, So, for example, in the Cuban context, people like to call divinities such as Chango, that are Afro-diasporic divinities, but they are conflated in very interesting ways with Catholic, saints like Santa Barbara. So, here clearly there's something very interesting going on, because Chango is masculine and Santa Barbara by her very name is feminine, but that doesn't seem to prevent people from completely associating these two together. And the word syncretic is used to explain technically what is going on there. And this is a slightly different version of syncretism than this idea of Bon Bibi bringing together Hinduism and Islam and coming together in one figure. This other idea of syncretism is more one of palimpsestic kind of layering. In either case, I do find that since clearly a figure like Chango and Santa Barbara are also creolized together, so I'm like thinking, can we have a theoretical tool kit, where syncretism can be seen as useful to explain a kind of process, but it shouldn't be then seen as a way to just kind of like say that is all syncretic, So, this is just one thing I'm toying with, so it might be something to think about together. But going back to your material, what I found was very interesting there was, again, these micro stories that you, obviously, that's an ethnographer's gift, and you bring all this out beautifully. I particularly loved the way you were using, the local language, the particular turns of phrase. I mean, the idea of tan, mile mishe thaka, khichuri, then various other things also, khomota, then there was one for something jagroto. So, the things that are, these are kind of ordinary words, but they also become alive, with another potential because of the way you explain them and the way they're used. I thought that there was actually one of the most interesting archipelagic possibilities of this work. And I'll also put in that same sort of space, I think, these beings of the water, the crocodiles, and, you rightly, I'm sure you wouldn't want us to think that they're anthropomorphized, or, those, you don't want to think of this, that's the only way. There's some other thing going on when they're wearing their little bindis and, adorned in a way that signifies their specialness and their sacredness, but that doesn't mean they're to be thought of as kind of participating in kind of like, humanizing. But these water beings have struck me as fascinating and special, and I found the chronology of the fact that they are now slipping into the past extremely telling. So I think I wanted to focus focus my comments now on these beings, and perhaps throw in some ways in which you could work further with the archipelagic through them. Indeed, with the other particularities of the space that you have pointed out to us, including the language, the topography, the words used for these creeks and these dikes and all the rest. So I think that the idea of the archipelagic, Glissant, of course, gives us relation and relationality. But further on, there's been a lot of consensus such that there is in this body of thinking around I think the biggest gift also that archipelagic thinking gives us is this ability to think about continuity in discontinuity. So if we want to make statements about why things are similar or comparability of different things, we don't need to look for a way to bring them together. We can actually insist or want to keep them in discrete, segmented and even isolated and fragmented units, but then we adopt a different vision, another epistemology, and that is precisely the archipelagic. So I felt it was quite fascinating then that probably when you look ethnographically, it would be interesting to see other such spaces around the world where perhaps there are these littoral, deltaic, archipelagic, topographies where you have perhaps similar but completely different, of course, because that they are rooted in the local space and mores. But constructs, concepts, and ways to deal with challenges, particularly of the kind of contaminated present. And since this contamination is a product of global modernity, that's the kind of framework, isn't it? Which could legitimize a kind of move to look for other such topographies and their ethnographic explications. And then you would bring it all back, of course, to try and see how those could give you further tools to make sense of what is exactly going on in your space. The one thing that I found, as I said, really suggestive is not just that these fascinating beings, these crocodiles and so on, exist, and they exist in a way that's across all those religious, they are approached and understood by all the different religious and sub-religious communities that live together in the Sundarbans. So it's another kind of, we don't have to think about syncretism, as you said, we can think of another way in which that kind of living together, commensality, etc., conviviality is being carried out. It's an archipelagic way. It's perhaps creolized, but we can talk about that separately. I don't want to go into creolization now because it'll take us into beyond my few minutes left. So just simply to say that these beings are fascinating enough, but even more fascinating is the fact that, as you said, even right now, they're being relegated or put into the past. They're slipping out of reach. And they're also physically slipping away from those spaces and going into different waterways, which are obviously, again, a fascinating archipelagical connections to other parts. These are these channels that then open out in the Indian Ocean, a bit like Amitav Ghosh's dolphins, So the question is, where do they go? Or where have they gone? And that pastness and their disappearance is kind of becomes a space-time kind of issue, And here, Luca, I think, will realize I'm alluding to some work we are doing right now on a Japanese thinker, Ryuta Imafuku. We are publishing his work in a translation, not from the Japanese, because neither of us know Japanese. Luckily for us, Ryuta knows Portuguese, and he has written everything in Portuguese, and we are translating it. So Ryuta, but one of the works that we are using to contextualize the stuff we are translating is in English. We'll send the link to you. It's about the archipelagizing of time itself. And he's using Nagasaki and the atomic, explosion to talk about how time itself became fragmented into units. But then there are ways of finding a way to archipelagically link those units of time together. So he is really giving us a very exciting set of tools to think with, and we'll be glad to share this material with you. Luca, if you have the reference handy, maybe you can drop into the chat so that the others can also hear it. But I'll stop there. There are really many new archipelagic pathways to go down. This is what we're doing. We're sharing all our, all the stuff we're learning with each other. But the critique that you bring or the limitations that you find at the moment with archipelagic thought is actually an invitation, isn't it, for you to bring that space that you are, you are so, knowledgeable about, to theorize about it in ways that the idea of the archipelago itself can, can be archipelagized further to contain the materials of the Sundarbans. So I'll stop there, and hopefully there are some questions, Luca. But thank you again, Calynn. That was really stimulating, and we enjoyed it, didn't we? So over to you,
Thank
Luca.
you.
Yes, there are no questions at the moment, and I was trying to look for the reference to share, so I was a bit distracted. But
yes, Luca has asked for the reference
yes. So
yeah, I can also
start. I will
somewhere.
Do so as soon as possible, so that we get the opportunity for the live screening to share it with everybody. But I will. If anybody in the meantime has any question, or Calynn, if you want to, I don't know, share your further thoughts with us.
I can respond briefly to.
Sure,
certainly. Yes, thank you for those comments. They were very generative and helpful for me. It's funny actually that you brought up Afro-diasporic religions, because I'm teaching a class right now on ethics and ecology, and part of that has been studying some of these, reading with my students some of this work on Bombibi and the critique of syncretism. And I have a student who's focusing on Afro-Brazilian religions for her project, and a lot of that literature was talking about syncretism. And she came to me and said, but I thought this was, is this okay that they, and then I'm rethinking also the literature that I'm immersed in from Bengal, which has kind of mounted this for some time now, mounted this critique against this concept of syncretism. And I think you're right, because are there ways, let me revisit this, can we have it as a toolkit in which the idea of something syncretic can be used and can be applied meaningfully? And I think that probably there is space for that, as long as we're attentive to process and history and agency and creativity of people, as opposed to some sort of implication that there's this third object, that is a syncretic religion that they are participating in, as opposed to teasing out some of these more complicated relationships. And so I did find, at least with my limited engagement with archipelagic thought up to this point, I've found that helpful, and I look forward to hopefully carrying that forward in some of the ways that you've so helpfully presented. And yeah, but this question of syncretism, it struck me because I was just having that conversation earlier this week with one of my students, and I think I will be looking for more comparative studies in the future, as well, as I think about the broader kind of theoretical implications of some of this. So thank you.
No, but that's really exciting to know that, of course, from where you are in your discipline, teaching, in religious studies, this is actually a very good place to start, not just a critique, but a rethinking of syncretism across the board. I can see a conference panel coming up somewhere. Who knows, but I think it would be useful for a lot of people, again, as your student coming from a completely different, or interested in, aware of a set of different practices, wonders what then. This is also very interesting cross-pollination. What then? Yeah, we have to deal with it. We can't just say, let's just use the word in one set of the, critique it in one part of the, world, but we have to be prepared to answer our students, at least, when they say, but what about another? So I think, so thank you, Luca. You have dug out the reference. People can see it in the chat.
Thank you.
Yes,
really,
and there are the pages are missing, but you can find the book, and it will be there. There is a question, Calynn, if you are willing to take one. Shritama is thanking you for your talk, first of all, and the question goes: you mentioned the underwater a few times in reference to the crocodile, the pool of water. How do you read the underwater in relation to the archipelagic, conceptually and materially?
Okay, yeah, this is a good question. So I will preface this by saying, I don't know that I will have a full response, but I will have a response that it comes from some of the way that I've been thinking about this up until now. And I'm presently in the process of, turning the dissertation into a book and such, and so reconceptualizing things too. And I think that this will be something I can hopefully think a little bit more about. But the underwater. Okay, so something that I've been trying to think about in terms of space and place and the focus on water, and one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on water was because of some of that kind of interconnection of scales that I mentioned, and also how an attentiveness to water allowed me to be more attuned to kind of the volumetrics of space in a way, the atmosphere, but also the groundwater. And so we see this a little bit with some of the discussion of the water beings. Well, where did they go? Maybe they left out the river, maybe they went down to the groundwater aquifers. And there are tremendous material connections between these different waters, some of them saltwater, some of them freshwater in the Delta, but there are also kind of conceptual connections. And I was very intrigued by that, and part of my work focuses on this groundwater, for example, which is another kind of submerged space that is inaccessible directly to the senses, and yet has become a space of tremendous imaginative engagement for people that I spoke with there, and also a lot of moral and political claims and contestation over whether people should be pumping groundwater for irrigation and such. So that is, I would say, it's not just the underwater, but it's also this kind of trying to think about space not as a flat kind of map, but as something that is extending, upwards and downwards, in experientially, how people make sense of that. And this provocation of archipelagic thought helps me also think about it a little bit more broadly across islands. I mean, there's something I didn't even get into, which is when I'm thinking about water and underwater connections, and even people's own movements within this archipelago and how it's been connected out to the wider Indian Ocean world. Many of my interlocutors, for example, work for periods of time in the Andaman Islands. And so historically, they have traveled by boat on barges from Kolkata. Now they mostly fly on planes, but they are traveling there. And so there's kind of like a wider archipelago of displacement that I'm trying to think about. Because especially from parts of East Bengal, what is now present-day Bangladesh, especially when partition happened, and then successive waves of displacement of primarily Hindu refugees, and sometimes they're not exactly refugees, but maybe some combination of difficulties in Bangladesh as well as economic reasons. They've come to West Bengal, but they often also have family in the Andaman Islands. So there's these circulations that are happening. So that is another connection with the water that's not necessarily underwater. I don't know if I've spoken to your question substantially, but these are some of my formative or thoughts and formation, I guess, on this question. I hope that speaks to it a bit.
Ananya, Ananya dropped in the chat box something that I was exactly thinking.
Yes.
When you were mentioned that, which is the book that I think, would be interesting in this, in this idea of the archipelago of resettlement. So Evelyn, the Spiritu Gandhi's Archipelagos of Resettlement. I was also thinking, in case, I mean, I don't know, it's just something that, that has switched in my head. Thinking about the underwater, well, clearly, I mean, it's a clear reference, but it's Brathwaite, Kamal Brathwaite's Unity submarine, right? So, I mean, maybe, that's something that could help, all of us actually thinking about, the underwater potentialities of archipelagic relationality. Lots of IT here in my sentences, but
thank you for these suggestions. Yes, I just found out about archipelagos of resettlement last week, so it's been I haven't quite worked through it yet, but yeah, I'm really interested in that argument, and I need to read that book. Thank you, and these are fabulous suggestions. I'm looking forward to it.
Quite interesting because I mentioned it at Sritama's talk last month. Sritama actually had another sub question. I'm so sorry, Sritama. I kind of like dismissed it and it's disappeared. I mean, I didn't dismiss it. I said something, I've answered it or something, and it's gone. But I think Sritama's comment was really about the Andamans, which she was saying that, yes, it has come up in her work too.
Okay.
This is fascinating for us, you know, because yeah, this is what we wanted to do. Obviously, it would be lovely to have a conference or a workshop where everybody is together. But sequentially, we have moved the Andamans, the Lakshadweep, and other Sundarbans. But it's extremely gratifying when, you know, people working on one space, you see that already amongst your own research, these connections are being, you know, kind of generated. Sritama, please feel free to put that comment back in there in the Q&A or ask an ancillary question if you want. Sorry about that. She has, it's lovely to see Niranjana. Do you want to take that question? Luca, do you want to?
Sure. Niranjana Ramesh is thanking you both, Ananya and Calynn, for your explorations of this idea of archipelagic thinking. Niranjana has a bit of conundrum when thinking with her own research in Chennai between archipelagic, fluid, relational thinking and Fisher's claims to rooted belonging and indigeneity in response to the ground water below them itself shifting and moving away from their grasp because of ports, other infra projects, etc. So the question is, what could be the political salience or relevance of archipelagic thinking in this context?
Thank you. This is a fantastic question, and it's so important. And I suppose I'll answer it in a way that speaks to my engagements with thinking about rooted belonging and indigeneity and the idea of place, right? And that animates, I guess, this talk and a lot of my work in general has I think, at least in the fields that I'm most familiar with, been addressed often from an Indigenous studies, critical Indigenous studies perspective, and sometimes an emphasis on land, for example, and when you're moving into an aqueous space of shifting, a shifting fluid geography that is, you know, not only is the space itself shifting, but the people are also not Indigenous to the space, and their narratives of belonging and the way they stake their claims is that we came from somewhere else and we transformed this space and now we live here, has kind of challenged me to think about this question. And it's also in the context of, you know, there are various reasons why people's relationships to this place are under threat, I suppose, at present. So not, of course, climate change is a big one that people talk about a lot, but, you know, more immediately, maybe there's conservation issues and people are increasingly, you know, not working in the forest because they can't get passes, or there have been plans that the certain islands of the Delta on this side, you know, powerful conservation and development actors have proposed that it would be better if no one lived there at all and that everyone should leave. And I suppose that part of that is also linked to this idea that they're not Indigenous, and or at least like that idea can emerge in a different way when you're talking about groups of migrants and refugees, perhaps. But I think it also is just a politically and theoretically just a reason to think about how we approach belonging and claims to belonging, and certainly in some contexts and some relational configurations, this like emphasis on land or on rootedness might be the way that people choose to stake their claims, and in other contexts they might stake their claims in a different way. And so that's what I've been trying to think about. And I do think that people in the Sundarbans are staking claims to this place in a somewhat different register. But I don't think that makes it any more or less legitimate. And so I've been trying to think about what that register is, if that makes sense.
I also thought that perhaps, I mean, it's a really important question again, because kind of makes us think about whether, you know, our politics and, I mean, people's needs on the ground and our theoretical desires, like, is there commensurability between these different agendas, if you like, or different directions. But I think but this is where the scale kind of thing becomes important. If you zoom in into those people wanting to say that they're rooted, I think that, it looks like a different picture than if you zoom out and you see, again, relationally, all those different claims, because many people will be making those claims, So I think it's a question also, the archipelagic need not impose itself on the claims that the people who live in these spaces make. It's a lens we are bringing to understand what they are doing with their lives, how we grasp their histories and so on, So I don't think we need to demand that they themselves, should want to present as I don't know, amphibian or, unmoored or floating around. Most people don't think like that. I'm sure it's common sense. I mean, I think it's us who wants to perhaps say there is a way of us assessing what's going on. I mean, Niranjan, I think that's the way I would also approach your very important observation. And maybe we go back to the idea of depth and volume there, which I thought was very compelling, because then they may not have a superficial, on the surface level, the relationship may not look archipelagic. But if we do a cross-sectional, kind of examination, maybe these aquifers and other kinds of channels underground, that you're talking about, could bring a completely different picture, onto view of, subterranean, submarine, routes. I'm thinking of a couple of things here. I'm thinking of Meg Samuelson's concept of the littoral, where, there is a sense in which people on the littorals may not, even Michael Pearson actually, littoral societies need not behave archipelagically in the way we want them to. They are littoral and they have, so I think that could be kind of useful. And also Sumati Ramaswamy's very, classic work on Lemuria and all these underground, underwater actually connections between peninsular India and other islands and masses floating around and so on. So I think there are different ways of conceptualizing the rootedness of people on the shore, or their desire, to be seen as fixed to that spot. We can nevertheless, I think, archipelagize them in different ways. So that was my thought, but a really important, obviously, consideration there.
Niranjana is thinking. Can I bring in just an image from your talk, Calynn, which got me thinking. Didn't have much time because it was at the beginning, so I had to follow the rest of your talk. And it's the image of the very material reality of the embankments that So I was wondering whether that it is something that we can say whether these embankments are doing anything to this pool of water. Are they enabler? Are they on the contrary, do they become an obstacle? The reason why I was fascinated by them is that following Ghosh's own, in his last novel, the tracing relationships between the Sundarbans and Venice is, hot topic, the Mose, those artificial embankments that have been, they've been built recently, and in Italy there was a huge, clearly it's a huge scandal, a floppy project, etc. But apart from that, there was also this idea that Venice, for the first time, would be separated by the sea, right? So symbolically, what that meant for the city of Venice to be separated by a larger pool of water, which is not just that with the surrounding waters of the island, but is that, kind of call towards what lies across, right? Those maritime sort of extents. And in a sense, another thing that got me thinking, but very cartoonish in a sense, but when I was thinking about the pool of water, I was reminded of a cartoon itself, which is Moana, you know, which is my son's favorite cartoon.
With my 2-year-old. I can't get
exactly
away from
like my 3-year-old is, you know, it's his favorite cartoon, and that pool of water is very different because it's not necessarily with, you know, kind of, it is somehow also related to the spirits of the water surrounding that, but it's also what lies behind, right? The seas and, you know, other islands. So yeah, I mean, I was just wondering whether these few images could, there's anything that you could add or think about.
Certainly. I think, well, the image of the open sea that you've ended here with is, I actually think most of the people that I know in the Sundarbans are find the open sea quite scary and alarming, and do not go there. If they're fishing, it's primarily like, well, there's different sorts of fishing. There's these inland water bodies like the one I was talking about, which have now been kind of sealed off, and that disconnection is from the tidal ecology has been really transformative. At first I was thinking, well, maybe it's just because this space has become less and less kind of natural over time, and that's why these spirits are seen as having left, so to speak. But I don't know. I mean, creating that embankment and that water body as a freshwater reservoir was so vital for people, especially in the early years of settlement when it was the source of a lot of their drinking water. So there's that, and I think that's almost what maybe, I don't know, you know, what makes this space an awakened space in a way. Water is, of course, as many people have picked up on, so vital, a vital substance, and it has a kind of liveliness that is not contained within any one religious or social or cultural system. It comes up time and again, and I wonder if this fresh water, if that plays a role in some of these meanings and how important it's been. Since the tidal rivers are quite, people who fish on the tidal rivers sometimes perform Ganga Puja, as I've mentioned, and have a positive and at times quite poetic way of expressing their relationship with the river. But most of the farmers that I know there do not want to be involved with the tidal rivers because they're hugely destructive when they break down embankments and flood fields, and then you can't grow anything for a few years. And so there's no kind of like, I feel like there's no one relationship to these different forms of water, and it depends also on what sort of work you're doing and all of that. And then the open sea, though, no one I knew is an open sea fisher or is engaged with that space. But the embankments themselves and what they do, the embankment question is a really big question. Also in the scholarship on the Sundarbans, there's been a lot, like in Camelia Devan's recent book, she has a wonderful chapter on the kind of history of the embankment construction during the British colonial period and the attempt to fix these spaces, and how it's had very deleterious effects over time, and how it's being kind of reimagined during the era of climate change, but having, again, deleterious effects and actually exacerbating some of the things that it's purporting to solve. So the embankments on the West Bengal side of the border are a bit different because they're not the large polders, but more recently, following some of these cyclones, and Debjani Bhattacharya and Meghna Mehta have written about this, there's been an effort to make these to redo these embankments, to turn them into these big concrete and brick embankments that can't be managed locally because they require kind of large machinery and such. But then when they break during storms, people can't repair them like they used to repair the mud embankments. And so there's a whole range of different issues with the embankments and how they cause the river siltation dynamics to transform. And you know, some engineers and scientists argue that they make this space, since these islands can't silt, they're kind of sinking, right? Because that silt is not being allowed in because of the embankment. And then on top of something that people know these things, people talk all the time about how we're pumping so much groundwater, our land is going to sink like it has in places like Indonesia, where subsidence is a huge issue. And so there's all of these different kind of layers, I suppose, to the embankment question, and it's a big one. I don't know if that speaks a little bit to, I guess I'm thinking about these things more infrastructurally, but
yeah, no, sure. Thanks.
Well, I cannot say that I have any knowledge about Moana because of little people around who are kind of invested in it. But it is true, of course. I mean, I'm sure everybody who sees that cartoon knows it. I mean, that Moana, of course, means ocean, right? So it has that whole rather different, again, Epeli Haufa kind of idea of a sea of islands around it, which takes us to such a different kind of ocean space, oceanscape, than what you're talking about. That here we have people who don't actually want to just sail off into the high seas, whereas Epeli Haufa is talking about the ocean as home, then that's quite normal for people to imagine. Having the high seas at the ocean as the backyard almost. So I think we see again this, variegation really. There isn't any one kind of waterscape, aquascape to play with. And people, what we take from these ethnographies, such as yours, are very kind of, detailed understandings of people's minds and how they relate to land and water conjunctions in their specific domains and what they do to resolve them. But it's been marvelous, really, such a glimpse and a different one from ones that we have heard from Sritama, of course, from what we have read through Anu's work and so on. So it's really it's fun. It's exciting to be exposed to new work and to can't wait for the book. So good luck.
That's very kind.
Thank you. Project. I have to run, Luca. So shall we see if there's anybody else who would like to ask a question?
Yes, I don't see any questions, but if anybody of those attending want to add one, please do so. Manifest it in the.
I will leave at this moment before people.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
See you later, everybody.
Bye,
Thanks for coming. Okay, bye.
Bye.
However, I do think that there are no other questions, so I will talk very slowly, just to allow people to drop a last-minute question, but we are right on time, 2 minutes to our scheduled end of the seminar. So I think we can thank you very much, Calynn, for accepting our invitation. As Ananya was saying, these are, we knew from the beginning that with our decision to open up to the Sundarbans, we were also moving geographically in a region which is not necessarily, not strictly speaking archipelagic as the islands of the Lakshadweep and the Andamans are. So it is, I think this was really powerful and enriching for us to start thinking about other geographies and their relation to water, whether it's seawater or the fluvial waters surrounding it, and the specificity of the Sundarbans clearly is, makes it even more exciting. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And for those who have attended this seminar and who are watching it, watching the recording, we hope to come back next year, in the next academic year, with new openings towards other geographies of archipelagic India. So stay tuned. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.